This video was brought to you by my loyal patrons. Pledge today and you can participate in choosing what video comes to the channel next. Link in the description.
Once upon a time, there was a little engine called Edward. He lived in a shed with 5 other engines.
And just like that, a legacy was born. Hello everyone! Time for another extraordinarily long video where I rank stuff. Today we are talking about the Railway series, the classic children's book series that Thomas the Tank Engine was based on, written by Reverend Wilbert Awdry and continued by his son, Christopher. I don't think this famous book series needs much of an introduction. We here all know the history behind it. Christopher was ill in bed as a child in the 40s, so Wilbert told him stories about anthropomorphic trains to entertain him. He loved them so much that Wilbert made a book of them for him. His wife Margaret urged him to publish it. It was a huge success, so he kept writing. And writing. And writing. It eventually led to the TV show in the 80s, yada yada yada. You all know the story. Wilbert wrote 26 books, and then retired in 1972. Christopher took up his father's mantle and continued the series 10 years later, bringing the final total to 42 books. And that's what we're ranking today, folks. This is easily the longest ranking video yet, with 42 items to talk about. There is a lot of content to go through, and it's pretty dang hard because I consider most of the books on this list to be pretty dang great. How on earth is it possible to rank all 42, you ask? By abiding by a set of rules, of course. So before we get started, allow me to explain them. I set 3 rules, and the book's placement on this list is decided by how well it hits each of them. Number 1 is structure. Is there an overarching plot to the book? Is there an overall arc that connects all 4 stories, or some sort of theme that they all relate to? Or is it just 4 random stories that don't really relate to anything? Number 2 is world building. This refers to anything new the book introduces to the series. New locations, flashbacks, histories, or new characters. Do these new characters add anything to the universe? Do any of the previously established characters show any significant growth? And lastly, memorability. How memorable are the stories in the book? The book could have no overarching theme, but if all the stories are bangers, then that will help its ranking. I also won't lie to you all. Personal bias will also play a factor here. Some I just like more than others for personal reasons, which I'll explain as we go. It's my list, I can rank them as I like. I should also mention that none of the one-off books like Thomas's Christmas Party or Thomas and the Evil Diesel will be included here. We are focusing only on the 42 main books of the series. Perhaps we'll cover those one-offs and all those annual stories the Awdrys wrote another time. And lastly, this should go without saying, but everything said here is just my opinion. Nothing is fact, none of this means anything in the grand scheme of things. If you love a book that I don't particularly rank highly, then there's nothing wrong with that. This is all just for fun. Okay, we have a lot to go through today, so let's keep this as snappy as possible. Let's get started. Number 42. New Little Engine. Yeah, this is the worst book. I think Christopher's books in general were all pretty hit or miss, but his later ones are just so forgettable. That's the word I would use to describe this book. Forgettable. And that's the worst thing a book in this series can be. I legit had to look up what happened in this for this video because I totally forgot what the stories were. A story with Rheneas losing traction, Peter Sam in some dirty water in Wales, Sir Handel sulks in a shed, and then something regarding Skarloey and a pig, which somehow ties into Ibohu getting introduced. For a book called New Little Engine, the New Little Engine does not appear until the last 2 pages of the book, and he has no lines. Why did they build him? Why is he there? What is his personality? No one knows. Another book, Jock the New Engine, does a very similar concept and is much more engaging, I think. None of the stories are connected really, and I don't think any of them are memorable. While it does world build technically with the introduction of Avohugh, he barely does anything that it doesn't really matter. The definitive NPC of the series. Fred is also technically introduced in this book. You never see him in an illustration, and they don't explain how or why he's there, but he exists too, I guess. This book doesn't feel inspired at all, and feels like it was written more out of obligation than anything to tie in with Taliclin's new build engine, Tom Rolt. Worst of the series. Number 41. Thomas and the Fat Controller's Engines. Another forgettable book, with no real overarching plot. This book was written to celebrate the Golden Jubilee of the very first Railway series book in 1945. The Railway series does exist within the universe, because it's meta like that, and a celebration for it is to be held at the big station. Prince Charles comes and gives a speech, etc. Sounds like a big event, and you'd think this is something that'd span the whole book, but it doesn't. It's only in the final story. There's an attempt at structure having the event mentioned in the first story, but it's completely unrelated to what the plot of that story is. The first 3 stories have nothing to do with each other. Gordon nearly kills a bird, Edward loses a wheel, and Thomas derails because of rabbits digging holes under the track. What do any of these have to do with the Golden Jubilee celebration? For a book called Thomas and the Fat Controller's Engines, the book has shockingly little Thomas in it, and most of the engines don't do anything. Again, none of these stories are all that memorable. Although I will say the visual of Gordon striking a crow is pretty dang funny. This is a pretty good illustration. It had the potential to be so much more, but like the rest of Chris's later books, this felt like it was written out of obligation more than inspiration. Number 40. Great Little Engines. Man, Chris really did not know how to write for the Skarloey engines, did he? He only wrote 2 books on them, and this one, like the other one, also feels like it was written out of obligation more so than any sort of actual inspiration. From what I understand, this book was written in accordance with Prince Charles and Diana visiting the Taliclin Railway in real life, and dressing up one of their engines as Sir Handel for their Thomas days. The book plays this off as if the real Sir Handel actually went to Wales and met the Prince and Princess, and follows his adventures there. That, in theory, sounds like a really fun idea for a book, and the last story that does that is the funnest story in it. In real life, the real quote-unquote Sir Handel hit a tree near the line and the face on it got damaged, so the crew bandaged it up. And the book plays this off like Sir Handel actually got a black eye. This is really funny and meta, and I'd love it if the book was more of this. But it's not. The other 3 stories have no relation to it. Again, I had to look up the stories online to remember what even happened here. Sir Handel leaves the guard behind, a story we've done a million times in the series already. Peter Sam gets stuck in some branches, and my all-time favorite story ever, Pop's Special. The plot of which some Boy Scouts are thirsty, so Duncan brings them soda. That's it. That's the whole story. No conflict. Why is this Duncan? He's not even written as Duncan, he's just some NPC nice guy character. The last story where Sir Handel has to get an eye patch is the most notable thing about this book, but other than that, it's all a total dud. Pretty forgettable. Number 39. James and the Diesel Engines. Now I have gone on record of saying that I think this is Chris's weakest book. And yes, I do think this is a notably weak one. But after revisiting all of them, I don't think it is his worst. The idea of this book is awesome, following up on James's prejudice with diesels, something that was subtly set up by Wilbert in his books. James badmouths Diesel. He encourages Duncan to keep putting down Rusty. He's a jerk to Boko. And in the time those stories were written, James's motives made some sense. Diesels were new at the time, and they did pose a threat to steam engines. This book was written in the 80s, much later, during a time when diesels were a norm on railways, and most of the lasting steam engines had grown to accept them. All except James. This is a good concept. Problem is the book is structured horribly. The first story is about a visiting diesel that crashes into the shed. Okay, this is fine. A nice intro to the callousness of some diesels, and gives a starting point for James to complain about them again. Second story, James says diesels are weird, and then he hits a signal. Alright. Third story. Absolutely nothing to do with diesels. It's a Henry story, completely unrelated to everything. Why is this here? Last story is the big finale where diesels win James over, and it's in the most anticlimactic way possible. James breaks down and some random diesel we never learn the name of nor see the face of rescues him. What the hell is this? Who is this? Why isn't this Bear, or a diesel we're familiar with, or a diesel that the book set up earlier? Why is it just some NPC? Really? This is the one to change James's mind? Such a colossal missed opportunity to build the characters of the diesels we already know. The theme of this book is pretty inspired and relevant to the time it was written, and the first story with Old Stuck-Up is pretty memorable, I think, but it's a book that is very unfocused. The word I would use to describe this book is half-baked. I feel like so much more could have happened here that was wasted. Number 38. Thomas and His Friends. I have mixed feelings on this book. This is the final installment of the series, and as a finale, it's terrible. It's lacking in any sort of grandeur or spectacle. I think we all expected a really nice send-off to the series, and credit where credit is due. The last page where they unveil a bust of Wilbert Audrey in the big station is very heartwarming. But the rest of the book is so unrelated to any of that. This is the book where Gordon is famously retired from pulling the express. I love this so much, and I think it's so fitting that it happens in the final book of the series. I love how it's handled. The Fat Controller tells Gordon Pip and Emma have joined the railway, and as he talks, Gordon slowly understands what he's getting at. The words, "Gordon, I'm retiring you from the express," are never blatantly said. Gordon just understands. And as a humbled 90-year-old engine at this point, he accepts it. It's a really nice, subtle moment, and a nice bookend to Gordon's overall character journey. I also like how there is a story in this book that shows a little of what Gordon's life is like in post-retirement. That inclusion is very nice. The problem is that this should have been the plot of the whole book, leading up to the unveiling of the Audrey bust in the last story. Instead, what is an incredibly important moment in the series is shoehorned into the beginning of an unrelated story about Thomas and a frickin' swan. I'm sorry, what? And in the next story, Donald and Douglas bumping into buffers. Are you kidding me? What does this have to do with anything? Why is this unimportant, unrelated nothing story in the finale book of the series? I do love what Chris does with Gordon in this book, and that's why I rank it slightly higher than all the previous ones. We'll talk about it later once we get to it, but you can tell this lead up to Gordon's retirement was something Chris really wanted to focus on, but was probably pushed back by the publishers in favor of more Thomas-focused books. As this was the final book he'd ever be writing, he probably threw it in just so it could happen. But man, does it feel anticlimactic. Also, Clive Spong, what the hell, man? Why did you use the same illustration twice in the same story? This is just a redraw of the picture from the Fat Controller's engines. Oh my god, this is just lazy. You couldn't even be bothered to change the positions of the characters? A very unfocused and unsatisfying book. What should have been a grand finale to this 66-year-old series feels more like a minor footnote in the grand scheme of things. Number 37. Thomas and Victoria. This is a weird one, because it does have structure and an overall plot, unlike the previous ones. In this book, an old coach-turned-garden shed called Victoria gets rediscovered near Thomas's branch line. And over the course of the book, she gets restored into a working coach again. We even get a nice little flashback story to her old days when she worked on the Furness Railway with her own engine. But then the plot just stops dead, and we get some unrelated story about Daisy and eels. I'm sorry, what? What does this have to do with anything this book is about? Victoria's not even in this story. What is this? I also have to say, why is Thomas in the title of this? Thomas barely does anything in this book. He barely has any dialogue. Edward and Toby were more central characters to this, not him. I know, because marketability, but come on. If Thomas is in the title, I expect to see some Thomas focus. Random side tangent, but I think the illustrations are kind of bad in this book. Not bad as in poorly drawn, but bad as in they fail to convey what's being said in the text. Like here, this picture is meant to be Thomas hearing Victoria in the brush near the station. but we never see Victoria. This one is meant to be Thomas's driver talking to Victoria, but again, she's not shown. Or this one, in which Henrietta's balcony bends because of Toby's sudden stop. This could have easily been from a different angle that shows Toby stopping suddenly and Henry's balcony bending behind him. The direction of these illustrations is just lazy. Also, another side tangent. The story implies Victoria has been beside the station in the brush for many years. Why only now, all of a sudden, does she decide to speak up and say hello? This book takes place in like 2007. You're telling me she just sat there for 50, 60 odd years not saying anything? That's so dumb. Overall, a fairly sweet book that does feel somewhat inspired and builds the world a bit more. It doesn't feel like it was written out of obligation like the first few books on this list, but it's not great. I don't even know if I would say that this is good, to be honest. The stories, with the exception of the flashback one with Albert, are all pretty dang forgettable. Number 36. Wilbert the Forest Engine. The structure of this one is similar to Stepney's book. A real engine visits Sodor, and the book is about all the stuff that happened during the visit. The second story even has a flashback to give the real engine some historical context. The difference is, the Stepney stories are actually fun. This book is just boring. There's some inspired ideas in here, I'll give him that. I really like Cab Over Wheels, that's the standout definitely. And I like how Wilbert goes to other places on Sodor besides Thomas's branch. We get to see him on the Little Western too with all those guys. But, can you remember anything he does in these? Funny how in a book called Wilbert the Forest Engine, the most memorable story is the one that Wilbert doesn't do anything in. This book features a weird loose end that's never touched on again. The whole reason Wilbert comes to Sodor is because the Fat Controller wanted to trial an austerity tank engine like him. At the end of the book, he says an engine like Wilbert is exactly what he needs.
By the end of his stay, the Fat Controller knew that an engine like Wilbert was exactly what he needed.
Implying that's going to come into play later, but it's just never followed up on. That's not at the fault of this book, of course, but just a weird loose end I wanted to mention. Also, Percy's porridge. What even is this story? Percy has to go to the works because he ran over a sack of porridge? He's a 20-ton steam engine. That damaged him? Really? Wow, that's so stupid. Okay, so apparently this story was written as a creative writing exercise by some children, and the book is dedicated to them as a result. I don't actually own a physical copy of this book, so I didn't know that. The story is still dumb, though. This volume has the structure for a decent book, and all the stories do relate, but it's just not very memorable. I like Wilbert and all, and I like the idea of making the real steam engine named after Wilbert Awdry himself an actual character in the series, but it's a fairly skippable book. I'd rather a book with 4 random memorable stories than a book with 4 related stories that aren't that interesting. Number 35. Toby, Trucks, and Trouble. I find the title of this book funny. You can tell this book was basically just Chris wanting to write another Toby-centric book, but couldn't think of a title. That's basically what this is. It's Toby the Tram Engine 2. More fun times on the branch line with Toby and the characters most relevant to him. Chris has said before Toby was his favorite character, and that really comes across here. I love how there's a whole flashback story that shows us a little of Toby's life pre-Sodor. We got a glimpse of that in his very first book, of course, but this one shows us what his brothers looked like, the harbor he worked at, and even some other engines he came across on his travels. Pretty neat. I think the main problem with this book is that there just is no theme. There is no plot, nothing connecting any of these stories. Mavis hits a lorry, random flashback story with Toby, Percy kills Bulstrode, Toby derails on the crossing. Mavis and the lorry ends implying that Percy and Toby are going to have quite the workload with Mavis gone.
"I'm afraid it will mean more work for you, Percy," he said. And with that, they had to be content.
But not really? It doesn't really come into play again? Only thing it amounts to is Terrence helping out at Farquhar for a page, but that's really it. I also want to mention Bulstrode. He's introduced here, and is weirdly still relevant in the franchise still. I think it's so interesting that Chris's biggest impact on the legacy of the Thomas franchise was this random boat character who for some reason keeps showing up in the show and merchandise. Bulstrode was ultimately the franchise's greatest takeaway from Chris's books, and I find that really funny. Chris loves Toby, and you can tell he had some fun ideas in mind for him. That inspiration shines through in this book a little bit, sort of. I think the Toby-centric stories are fun, but the other two are pretty whatever. The lack of any structure or plot makes this book rather unimportant and kinda random. A pretty skippable one in the grand scheme of things, but a fine little volume if you just want more of the Branchline gang. But don't worry, there's no shortage of supply when it comes to those. Speaking of which, number 34, More About Thomas the Tank Engine. The book with the most unimaginative title ever. So the history of this book is fascinating, and I'll definitely go more into this in the next Thomas retrospective video. But basically what happened is that this book came out the same year as Season 2 of the TV show. At this point in time, the TV series was not allowed to write its own stories. Everything in it had to be based on existing Audrey-written print material. Well, they kind of wrote themselves into a hole with that, for there was a severe lack of Thomas-centric stories left in the books to adapt. They did most of them in Season 1. A new Thomas season with shockingly little Thomas in it just wouldn't fly. So what happened was that Chris Awdry was commissioned to write a book specifically all with Thomas-centric stories so they could use them in the show. 3 of the stories in this book, Thomas Percy and the Coal, The Runaway, and Better Late Than Ever, all became Season 2 episodes, and aired on TV the same year this book came out. In fact, the book came out only 2 days before the first of the episodes aired. There's a good chance kids at the time saw the TV adaptations before reading the book. Isn't that super fascinating? That being said, and perhaps it's TV nostalgia seeping in here, but I do like the stories in this book. The Runaway is probably my favorite one. Better Late Than Ever is kind of bland, but it's nice to see Birdie is still around. And I like the plot arc with Thomas and Percy. It only pertains to the first and last story, but it's fun. I like that their best frenemies relationship in the books is still very prominent, with Toby as the neutral chaotic in the middle of everything. Overall, it's an okay book. Not the best of Chris's work or anything, but it's fine. The stories are all fine. But God, I wish he had picked a better title than this. Number 33, Thomas Comes Home. So I put this, More About Thomas, and Toby Trucks in Trouble together because they're all kinda the same to me. They all follow a similar format. 3 books with random stories, each that take place on Thomas's branch line, all of which have no real overall plot. This book takes place while Thomas is away in York, so it just fills us in on what happened on the branch line while he was away. Daisy gets stuck in the snow, Percy nearly falls in the river, Toby pulls a mega train, and then they all come together for Thomas's return. Again, no structure. However, what I think this has over the previous 2 is the stories themselves. They're all pretty fun ones. I think the stories this time around are quite a bit better, definitely more memorable. Daisy in the snow was fun, a setting we've never seen her in. Percy chancing the bridge before it collapses is exciting, and would definitely have made a fun episode for the TV show. And I think pairing Daisy and George the Steamroller of all characters in the final story was a novel idea. A character pairing I never would have expected to see. Not a bad book by any means. Just kind of random. Doesn't add anything important to the plot of the series, it's just some more branchline stories. The fact Thomas is in the title means nothing. Number 32, Really Useful Engines. Chris's first book, and certainly not his worst. I actually kinda like this one. All the stories are completely unrelated ones about the 3 major tank engines in the series. First story is about Thomas, next is about Percy, third is about Duck. Then the final story is all 3 coming together and doing something epic. The structure is very reminiscent of the 3 railway engines, where we had an Edward story, a Gordon story, a Henry story, and then a final one where they all come together. Kinda appropriate that Chris's first book mirrors Wilbert's first book in that way. Chris cleverly sets up his plan for Gordon in this book too, showing him as tired and out of breath. He is no longer the grand energetic express engine he once was. We are fully dealing with a middle-aged Gordon now. I love that implied passage of time. I also love the consistency with Thomas and Gordon's alliance here. Thomas does tease Gordon a bit, but it's all playful. At the end, Gordon doesn't make fun of Thomas or say anything to belittle him. He instead winks at him.
Gordon looked at Thomas and smiled. Then he took 3 deep breaths and winked. He didn't need to say anything. Thomas knew exactly what he meant.
What a nice moment. Man, this character has grown. Okay, so the illustrations, they are just awful. I never really cared for Clive Spong as an illustrator, but I will admit he does get a lot better as the series goes on. But holy cow, these are bad illustrations. Why does Percy look like that? Why are their pupils so huge? It is so jarring going from the beautiful, real-life impressionist illustrations of the previous book to these. Not a fan at all. Easily the ugliest book of the whole Railway series if you ask me. But definitely not the worst book in general. Number 31. Thomas and the Twins. Yet another Thomas-centric Chris book. But this one is actually pretty fun. It's a pretty inspired idea. Thomas is too heavy to cross the bridge on his branch line while it's being repaired, so he goes to help Edward out on his branch line. And thus, the first time Thomas meets all the characters on it. I like this a lot. The world doesn't revolve around Thomas. There's quite a lot on Sodor Thomas has never actually seen before, which really puts into perspective just how big the world of the island of Sodor is. There are characters on this island that even Thomas has never met. Thomas meets Bill and Ben in this book, and I'm glad Bill and Ben got to appear in another book. They're really fun in this one. Pairing them up with Thomas was a good idea, considering all three are pretty much insufferable. There's some fun character moments.
But it's our colour, Ben, and Thomas doesn't think our colour is proper for an engine. They heard a grinding noise. Are your joints stiff, Bill? Asked Ben. But it wasn't Bill's joints. It was Thomas, gnashing his teeth.
World building is on point here. We see a lot more of the clay pits, a lot more of Brendam, and we're introduced to that stretch of line that floods called the Drain. We didn't get to see these places that much in the previous Bill and Ben book, so it's nice that they all get some focus again. We even get to see Trevor again, someone we haven't seen since his debut story all those years ago. Nice to know he's still around. Far from Chris's worst book. I'd say this is the first actual, solid, good book on this list. From this point on, every book on this list is good, if not great, which makes my job of ranking them all the more harder. Let's keep going. Number 30. Thomas and the Great Railway Show. So I have a personally fun history with this one. So as a kid, I only had the complete collection book, which featured none of Chris's books. Those never came out here. Yet somehow, my school library actually had this book, and I would check it out constantly and analyze the illustrations. So I have a bit of a fondness for it. The plot of this is Thomas is asked to go to the National Railway Museum in York to represent the Northwestern Railway. Like, yeah, it's another Thomas-focused book, and Thomas, of course, was selected because marketability and whatnot, but I still think the idea is rather inspired. We follow Thomas on his travels to York under his own steam. The first two stories cover his journey there, and the last two cover his adventures while he's in York, and all the various famous engines he meets. This book is like a very realistic version of Big World, Big Adventures. Just, not stupid. I think where this book falls flat for me though is the lack of famous engines present in the book. You'd think for a book made to basically advertise the National Railway Museum, more of the famous museum engines would appear or have roles. Green Arrow does, which is nice, and a couple others speak, but they're mostly confined to a single illustration. Would have loved to see more of them. It's a fun book that covers a fun event. Overall, pretty good in my opinion. Number 29. James the Red Engine. And the first Wilbert book finally makes an appearance on this list. This is undoubtedly his worst book, being one of the first. Wilbert himself has said that this is his least favorite because he was rushed to meet a deadline, and the end result kind of shows. It's apparent in the illustrations for sure, which are all over the place in terms of quality. This was Clarence Reginald Dalby's first book as illustrator, and it shows. Sometimes the engine's proportions and perspectives are just so out of whack, it's definitely the ugliest of the first 26. Even plot-wise, this feels kinda uninspired. James's character arc in this is just Thomas's recycled. It's literally the same story. Main character is cocky and rambunctious and confined to the yard. They wish to pull trains like the other big engines. Their lack of care causes incidents in the first 2 stories that humiliate them. They get a chance to prove themselves again in the 3rd story, both of which are about overcoming troublesome trucks, of course. And then a final story where another character fails and they step in and save the day. It's virtually the same plot. Nothing important happens in this book. That being said, even Wilbert's worst book is far from being a bad book. James's character arc may be a copy of another, but at least he has one. He has a character in this, and a personality totally unique to him. There are many Chris books where the featured character has an arc that is almost nothing, or just doesn't have one at all. This is a focused book, with 4 stories that are all connected and do build upon each other. It is an ugly, kind of nothing book, one that Wilbert himself didn't like, but it's still a classic one. Considering Wilbert's worst book is only number 29 of 42 on this list, I think that says a lot about the quality of his writing. Number 28, Jock the New Engine. I think this book gets some hate because of some weird continuity screw-ups on Chris's end, like how the miniature engines are fitted with radios in a time period where radios weren't a thing on the real-life counterpart railway yet, or like how they refer to Bert as a young engine when I think he is canonically a lot older than the others, but whatever. I can see how that would make some people angry. That aside, and just looking at the book on its own, I think this is one of Chris's more inspired pieces. This book, particularly the first story, is very meta, cleverly tying itself onto the original Miniature Engines book. Frank, a diesel who apparently came to the railway shortly after the events of Small Railway Engines, did not appear in that original book. The first story in this book takes place the year the first book came out, and we all know the Railway series exists within itself, so when Frank found out he wasn't in that book, he rebels. It's just so funny. Chris was definitely having a laugh when he put this one together. Possibly one of the most unique ways to introduce a new character. Oh, you have been around basically this whole time, but we just kind of forgot about you, and then said character gets upset about it. Unlike New Little Engine, which failed to have any build-up to Ivohue, this book does have build-up to the big reveal of Jock. Jock isn't some random newbie that shows up in the last story. The book's events build upon each other to the reveal, and then we have 2 whole stories to get to know the character a bit. He has a little arc too, becoming very cocky for his abilities, and learning sense in the last story. I quite like how each of the other main 3 all cleverly get roles as well. Rex gets the first story, Bert gets the second, and Mike gets the last. No one feels forgotten. Structure-wise and world-building-wise, this is definitely one of Chris's stronger volumes. Number 27, Tank Engine, Thomas Again. This is where ranking Wilbert's books starts to become difficult. I enjoy all of his books, so trying to place them in an order is a bit of a struggle. Tank Engine, Thomas Again is a fun, Thomas-centric book, with 4 stories that I do really like. There is no real structure to this one, it's just 4 random stories about what Thomas does on his branch line, and they're all fun and charming. The whole point of this book is to give the audience an idea of what life on Thomas's branch line is like, and show some more of that part of the world. Nothing too extraordinary or stand out, just a simple, nice, cute book, showing Thomas in the next stage of his life. It's fun looking back on this one knowing just how much Thomas's branch line changed over the series. It gained so many characters over the years. Toby, Percy, Daisy, Mavis, etc. It's neat looking back at a time when Thomas was the only engine on it. Nothing bad about this book at all, but since it doesn't really do anything all that exceptional, I'm placing it here. Number 26, Henry and the Express. Here's a Chris book that I really like. I like all the stories in this book, covering a period in Henry's life when he had to be overhauled and the events that come with that. All the stories are very different from each other, but all tie into that plot. The first is about Henry dealing with bad coal again, then the next story is getting him to the works for his overhaul, so he double-heads the Express with James, then a story focusing on James taking over Henry's duties while he's gone, and then Henry's comeback, but not in the way you would expect. It is a loose plot, but it is all related. You'd think something as mundane as getting an overhaul wouldn't make for such a fun premise for a book, yet Chris made it work, and it is fun. I also think it's kind of neat that this book came out towards the end of Chris's tenure, in a period where Thomas was obligated by the publishers to appear in every book, and eventually in every title. Thomas does not appear in a single story in this book. That's pretty cool. I love that restraint. I think the one thing I don't fully like about this book is the title. Henry and the Express is kind of a lame title. Like, yeah, the Express is kind of a thing in most of the stories, but it's not really about Henry pulling the Express or anything. It should have been called like Henry's Overhaul or something. Or maybe Henry the Express Engine, I don't know. It's just kind of bizarre. Also, this book confirms two things that I wish it hadn't. One, that the engines still have smokebox doors despite having faces.
The fireman cleared away more ashes, but when he tried to close Henry's smokebox door, it did not make the airtight fit that it should have done.
So like, the faces are the doors, apparently. Also, the engine's eyes can get bloodshot, which means they have blood. Now you can't unnotice it. You're welcome. Number 25. Henry the Green Engine. I swear I did not plan on both Henry books being right next to each other. It just sort of weirdly worked out that way. I've said it before, but this book was a real turning point of the Railway series. From this book onwards, Wilbert made the conscious decision that the island of Sodor was a real place, and all the engines are based on real existing locomotives. We get our first real place name drop in this book, which is Crewe.
I'm sending you to Crewe, a fine place for sick engines.
And Henry comes back from the works as a Black 5 steam engine. The illustrations really start to pick up in this book too. We go from the engines still looking really toy-like in the previous book, to looking a lot more giant with realistic proportions. Henry's arc in this book is wonderful, and he's very sympathetic. He suffers so much, and you view him in a totally different way than you did in the previous volumes. You feel kinda bad for the guy, and then feel so overjoyed for him when he returns home and steals the show. As we all know, prior to this, Wilbert hated Henry and considered writing him out of the series. That's why he's ill in the previous books, to set up his eventual departure. And I'll always appreciate Wilbert for going back on that and instead writing this character into something he could work with. A bad writer gets rid of stuff that doesn't work. A good writer makes that stuff work. While I like this book and every story in it, I rank it a bit lower because it is a weirdly unfocused book. The first 3 stories all relate, and then it just kind of forgets that the book is about Henry and has this weird short story devoted to Percy. What's this doing here? Then in the last story, we return back to Henry. I don't understand why this book has 5 stories instead of 4 like all the others. And I don't know why that random 5th story with Percy was even in this, but whatever. Makes the book all the more unique, I suppose. Number 24. Toby the Tram Engine. I don't really have much to say about this book other than I think it's good. This book, of course, introduces Toby, and is notably the first book to take us off the island of Sodor into real-life territory. Toby gets a really sweet debut story, giving us the history of his old railway and how the Fat Controller initially met him. An event with Thomas involving a policeman brings Toby to Sodor, and he has some adventures with the other characters, including Thomas, James, and a little old lady named Mrs. Kindly. I think the illustrations are all pretty good in this book too, considering it's a Dalby book. He really started to hit his stride around this time. The engine proportions are all pretty consistent, and he even throws in some neat details like this one of Toby's boiler. It's very clear by this point Audrey was providing Dalby actual photos of real engines to base the illustrations on. I like the book, and I love Toby of course, but other than that I don't think anything super substantial happens in it. I wish I had more to say about it, but I'm actually finding the words difficult. It's good, I like it, but it's far from the best. It's a good middle book in the overall ranking. Number 23. Troublesome Engines. So this whole era of the Railway series all kind of rank the same to me. You know, that mid-Dalby era, post-early Railway series era, before the stuff started getting really good. Troublesome Engines is the book that famously introduced Percy, a main staple for the franchise moving forward. What I love about this book is how well it utilized all the characters introduced at this point. With the exception of Thomas, who had a book to himself right before this, everyone does something significant. Gordon leads the strike. James and Henry have their own adventures that give them their motivations to join the strike. Good guy Edward comes along and steps in for them. And Percy, of course, gets the last 2 stories to himself. It's a fun, all the characters together do something book. The first of the series to do this, I think. The structure of this book is a little loose, but it's all there. 2 stories of build up to the strike, then a story where the strike happens, and then a final story that shows some resolution after. It's a good book. Certainly a memorable one. Number 22. The Twin Engines. So initially I had this book a lot closer to the top 10, but the more I thought about it, the more the book sank for me. In all honesty, I think this is possibly Wilbert's funniest book, with some of the best character interactions. The concept of these 2 steam engines just showing up on Sodor with no reason, and the Fat Controller bafflingly trying to figure them out is so comic. It's not realistic by any means, but who cares, it's funny.
"I hear you've lost your numbers," he said. "How did that happen?" "Me mourner slyly slip it off, sir. You ken how it is."
They just somehow lost their numbers, which is hilarious considering BR numbers were always painted on. Hysterical. The book has some great build-up, slowly revealing new information to us, like how we slowly find out Donald was the one the Fat Controller ordered, and Douglas was the stowaway. And that moment when you realize the Fat Controller was away in the deputation because he was on the mainland buying Douglas? Ugh, amazing. There's some fun, neat world-building stuff too, like with the reveal of Thomas's special coach, and Donald and Douglas's snowplow train consist. Where this book falls apart somewhat for me is how unnecessarily complex it is, and I'm referring specifically to the story The Missing Coach. So this story is rather famous in the Thomas world for being the story of a cancelled episode in the TV show. It was cancelled for being too confusing, and honestly, I get it. This story is a mess, and I still to this day do not understand what Donald and Douglas were trying to accomplish in it. Okay, so Douglas shunted away the coach by mistake, and if found out, worries he'll be sent away by the Fat Controller. So instead of having Donald take the rap, the two decide to switch tenders for some godforsaken reason, and Donald leaves the yard with Douglas's tender. So now Douglas is in the yard, pretending to be Donald, and plays dumb when the Fat Controller questions him. Okay, so, why did they have to switch tenders to accomplish this? Why couldn't Donald have just stayed and Douglas went away with the train? They don't have nameplates. They don't need to switch tenders to accomplish their goal. Of course the Fat Controller found them out. Their plan was so brain-dead stupid. I've gone on record of saying The Missing Coach is the dumbest story written by Wilbert, and I still stand by that. It's a crucial story in the saga of the twins too, which makes this book all the more frustrating. It's still a very good book though, with a very heartfelt ending.
"Does this mean that the both of us—" The Fat Controller smiled. "It means..." But the rest of his speech was drowned in a delighted chorus of cheers and whistles.
Number 21. Stepney the Bluebell Engine. I really like this book, and I think people might be surprised to see it so low in the ranking. The reason I place Stepney's book in a lower spot is because I don't think it overall adds that much to the Railway series. This book existed basically to promote the Bluebell Railway back in its infancy, before it became the big famous heritage railway it is today. And that's kind of it. Stepney comes to Sodor for not any real reason, just so the real engine could be promoted. The first 2 stories are basically just exposition dumps. The first one explains basically what was happening in British railways at the time. Steam engines were being scrapped across the country, and some lucky few were being saved by heritage lines. The second story's majority just talks about the engines saved on the Bluebell, until then transitioning into a story about Thomas and Stepney. The really fun stories don't occur until the last 2, but you know what? I'm okay with that. Many of these books exist to basically advertise real railways, and this book really helped the Bluebell a lot. Every kid into trains knows who Stepney is now thanks to this book, and subsequently his appearance in the TV series. And you also know what? The 2 really fun stories in this book are really fun. A good chase story, and then an epic finale where Stepney and Duck pull the express. I like it. This is also notably the first book illustrated by Gunvor and Peter Edwards. And god damn, I just love their illustrations. The trains and settings feel so real in these. The impressionistic style and dynamic lighting give these stories such a new audience perspective. It's a real shame that neither were brought back to illustrate Chris's books. Their dynamic flair would have definitely lifted those quite a bit. Number 20. Gordon the High-Speed Engine. I'll admit, I don't know if this book actually deserves to be this high on this list, and I think a lot of people will probably disagree with me. How could you put this above Stepney? But I'm a sucker for the series-long Gordon character arc, and this one is such a crucial middle step on that journey. This is, absolutely, undoubtedly, without argument, Chris Awdry's best book, and the most inspired volume of his installments. This one has it all. Structure-wise, perfect. There are no unrelated stories that have nothing to do with anything. All of our stories are focused on Gordon and his arc. The first story sets up the idea of an HST replacing Gordon, now middle-aged, and Gordon makes a fool of himself. Second story, he makes a second mistake that wasn't his fault and falls out with the Fat Controller. It feels so bad for Gordon here. That fear of replacement is a very real worry now. The third chapter, Gordon comes through and builds some of his confidence back up, but is again left in suspense at the end, wondering if the Fat Controller is still cross with him. And the last story, the HST finally makes its grand appearance, only for it to break down, and Gordon steps up to the occasion. I just love the ending line.
And with a swish and a roar, he was gone. Pip and Emma watched enviously. Douglas chuckled. Oh, he said to himself, yon Gordon's aye a high-speed engine, but it's me who's pulling the high-speed train.
Gives me chills, man. It packs even more of a punch knowing what happens later. Gordon wins the battle in this book, but not the war. His eventual obsolescence is on the horizon. A truly great book. Exceptional work on Chris's part. Sadly, it still falls victim to the sort of technical dialogue and kinda bland storytelling Chris's books are known for, so I unfortunately don't think it's worthy of being placed any higher than this. Chris is definitely a mixed bag when it comes to his stories, but I think Gordon's overall character journey was easily his best contribution to the series. I'm more than happy to place Gordon the High-Speed Engine, a Chris Awdry book, in my top 20. Number 19. Edward the Blue Engine. Well, this is probably a shock to you all. Considering I'm Edward's biggest fanboy, you'd probably think his book would be in the top 5 at least, right? Nah, not particularly. Let me explain. This is a great book, with some very sweet stories, with great world building as usual. For the first time, we finally get to see what life on Edward's branch line is like. We also get our very first mention of scrapping in this universe with the story Saved from Scrap, regarding Edward saving Trevor from the Cutter's Torch. There's a good Gordon and Edward story with cows, a fantastic Edward and James story with Old Iron, and wow, even a Birdie sequel story. These are all great. I think where this book falls flat for me is the shocking lack of Edward present in his own book. Every story in this book focuses on characters that aren't Edward. Gordon is the main in Cows, Trevor in Scrap, Birdie in Chase, and James in Old Iron. Edward is just a constant in all of them, and doesn't have a particularly strong character arc. However, I don't think that means the book is bad. All the stories in this book, barring Birdie's Chase, deal with the theme of obsolescence. Edward is old and worn in Cows, Trevor nearly meets his end, James calls Edward Old Iron. Edward does have a character arc in this. He proves he's more than a worthless old engine, and he does that multiple times, notably in saving Trevor, and also pushing himself to rescue a runaway James. I just don't think it's particularly well set up or executed well. That being said, I don't think the lack of a solid arc takes away from the charm of any of these stories. They're all really wonderful Edward Constant stories, with very sweet endings. I particularly love how Old Iron ends.
And you'll be glad to know that when Edward came home the other day, James and all the other engines gave him a tremendous welcome. The Fat Controller thinks he'll be deaf for weeks.
Number 18. Oliver the Western Engine. This is another book that I like a lot. but no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't think of a reason to place it higher. It doesn't do anything crazy amazing or anything, it's just a nice book that gives us an idea of what life on the Little Western is like. The first story follows up on the events set up in small railway engines. Duck is promoted to work the branch line to Arlesborough and ends his life as a station pilot, which is great continuity. The next two stories are focused on Oliver getting used to his new life on Sodor, following his escape to the island in enterprising engines. Again, really solid continuity. All the stories in this book are fantastic. I love them all. Donald's Duck has great character stuff with Duck and Donald. Toad Stands By beefs Toad up a bit, and we learn quite a bit more about what Oliver's personality is like in resource and sagacity. We're even introduced to Bulgy in the last story. I guess the reason I don't rank this any higher is because the book doesn't flow that well. Like, it's a Duck story that takes place way before everything else. Then it's an Oliver story, then another Oliver story that continues off the second story, and then it finishes with an unrelated Duck story. I know originally Wilbert wanted to call this Little Western Engines, which definitely fits the book more. This is much more a Duck and Oliver book, more so than just an Oliver book. There's nothing really wrong with this one, but I don't think this is a super outstanding volume either. Just a bunch of really fun Little Western focused stories. Number 17. Percy the Small Engine. This is infamously the book that led to the split of Wilbert and illustrator Clarence Dalby. Wilbert was so upset with the illustrations that he badmouthed Dalby, and Dalby quit on him. And you know what? I can't say I totally blame Wilbert for being upset, because the last few Dalby books before this were actually quite good. And then you look at some of the illustrations in this one, like this, and I just think, wow, that's a downgrade. Why is the scaling so wrong here? And then, ironically, Dalby's best work in the Railway series, period, is also in this book. I mean, wow, look at this one! The lighting is so beautiful, very atmospheric. Okay, so I started off talking about the illustrations because I think the history with them kind of dampens everyone's opinions on this book. Because illustrations aside, Percy the Small Engine is fantastic. Percy, who has been consistently in all the books since his debut, finally gets the spotlight to himself, and he has a fun little arc in this. When the workload at Tidmouth gets to be too much for one engine to handle, the Fat Controller brings a new engine in and promotes Percy to help rebuild the old Knapford Harbor, and eventually becomes a part of Thomas's branch line. And the books follow Percy's adventures over this time in his life. And over the course, he grows a bit as a character. Very cheeky and naive at the beginning, getting taken advantage of by the big engines. Duck arrives, who debuts in this book, and helps Percy stand up to them. Percy gets a bit more confident and stands up on his own to the big engines, and also to the stuffy helicopter Harold. And then he proves himself at the end in the final story, when he braves a flood to get the Sunday school children home. It's a nice little Percy book, who is in a very different place at the end than where he started, both literally and as a character. And as always, we get some world building too, with the introduction of Duck and the old harbor at Knapford being rebuilt. What more could you ask for? Number 16. Branch line engines. This was always a favorite of mine as a kid, and I actually considered placing this in the top 10 at first. The plot of this book is what happens on the branch after Thomas foolishly crashes into the station master's house, and the Fat Controller has to bring in a new engine to fill in for him. This book introduces Daisy, and I really like Daisy. Shockingly little focus on her in Wilbert's books, which is a shame because she is a very strong character. She's typical and snooty at first, unlikable really, but she becomes a character who does really try by the book's end. What I think is so clever about this book is how each of the 4 central characters get a story to themselves. Thomas gets the first one, obviously, Daisy gets the second, Toby steals the show in the 3rd story, and Percy gets the finale, and in typical Percy fashion, he crashes. If I were to have any gripes with this book, it's that I wish it somehow could have worked in some sort of Thomas and Daisy interactions. 2 characters who weirdly interact very little with each other in the books, even in Chris's stuff. It's a solid slice-of-life book with some great character moments. Every central character in it gets some time to shine. A delightful installment. Number 15. The 8 Famous Engines. I greatly appreciate this book specifically for the story Gordon Goes Foreign, which might possibly be the most clever in-joke of a story I have ever read. It was only in 2017 when me, a simpleton American, visited London on my own that I finally understood what the hell the story was about. The story is about a LMS engine claiming the big station in London is called Euston, and Gordon argues with him claiming it's called King's Cross. Duck chimes in and says it's Paddington. Only after getting to London, Gordon realizes the station is St. Pancras, and he's upset about it. Little kid me had no god-dang idea what any of this meant. In 2017, when I realized Euston was the LMS London terminus, King's Cross was the LNER's, etc., did it finally click. And adult me finally understood this simple story in a children's book series. The reason Gordon went to St. Pancras is because it's the Midland Route's terminus, and coming from Sodor, Gordon would have taken the Midland Route. When I realized this, I think my head popped. This is such a smart story that only trained people would get. Bravo, Wilbert. Bravo. Okay, that story aside, this is a really great ensemble book. All the characters get roles in this, except Edward for some reason. Where's he at? None of the stories are related. They're all random stories. But they do have an overarching theme. The theme of venturing into unknown territory. Percy wishes to venture past a danger sign to see what's past it. Gordon travels off to London. Toby treks the main line. And all the engines go to England for a grand gala. The theme here is big. Our characters that are usually confined to their usual corners of the island going to places unknown. Venturing outside the storybook island of Sodor to very real-world places. The new, more stylistic illustrations by John Kenny really add to the atmosphere of gigantism and wonder in this book. Wilbert had initially thought about ending the series with this book, and while it is a good book to end things on, I am so glad he didn't. He was in the middle of his stride here, pumping out a banger book after banger. I really have no issues with this book, other than the randomness of the stories make it a bit unfocused. Some nice build up to the Grand Gala in England would have made this hit harder, I think. But still overall, a great volume. Number 14. Tramway Engines. So the history of this book is kind of fascinating. So really, this book shouldn't exist. Wilbert wanted to end the Railway series at his big finale book he had built up to, Duke the Lost Engine, at an even 25, and then retire there. But the publishers urged him to make one more book focused on Thomas, so he gave in and wrote us Tramway Engines 2 years later. The first 2 stories are just that, 2 stories with Thomas in them, and the other 2 stories focus on a character that existed on his own model layout for years prior, Mavis. While I don't think Tramway Engines is the grand finale Wilbert's books deserved, I still think this is an excellent book, with so many fun character interactions between all the characters on Thomas's branch line. Ghost Train and Woolly Bear is a fun 2-parter focusing on Thomas and Percy, and Mavis and Toby's Tightrope are a fun 2-parter focused on Toby and Mavis. Even Daisy makes a brief appearance, who hasn't appeared at all since her debut book. Toby, of course, is the star of this book, with some of his best moments of the entire series. My personal favorite is the realization that he was only 100 yards from Mavis when she stuck on the crossing, and just sat there in the shed and watched her struggle before deciding to help her. I love Toby so much. Even in a book that Wilbert didn't necessarily want to make, he still delivered in fine style, once again showcasing a new character and a location not really focused on previously, this being Mavis and the Farquhar Tramway. That's something I think goes underappreciated about Wilbert's books. Every single one introduced something new for the series, whether that be a new location, a new character, or new history of existing characters, and everything that is introduced has a purpose. The Railway series was always world building and adding to its universe. It's such a content-rich series. Number 13. Mountain Engines. Before making this video, I tried to get a general consensus on Twitter of what everyone's least favorite Railway series book is. To my surprise, a lot of people said Mountain Engines. The reason being that it's focused on a railway and a selection of characters on Sodor that we never ever see again after this, and they are overall pointless. I get why people think that, but I do not agree with it. Mountain Engines focuses on a rack railway that climbs Kuldey Fell, the tallest mountain on Sodor. And it's true, we never ever see this railway again after this book. It is exclusive to this book only. And honestly, that's why I like it so much. Out of the blue, here comes this book on this whole new selection of characters and a part of Sodor we've never seen before. This book was always so mysterious to me as a kid for this reason. It felt like something totally separate and elusive from everything else. A true mystery railway, high in the mountains, separate from all the main goings-on. So the structure of this book is split into 2 sections. The first 2 stories are about Kuldey and him reminiscing on the old days, his first run, and what happened to another old engine he knew named Godrid. The last 2 stories are about what happens when Kuldey returns home, and shifts focus from him to Lord Harry, who has a really nice redemption arc. Kinda similar to Tramway Engines in a way, 2 pairs of sorta unrelated stories, with a new character introduced in the second half with a redemption arc. However, these pairs are actually tied together with Kuldey's return to the railway, and I really like that. You get to see the railway in both forms as a result. You get the original railway in the flashbacks of the first 2 stories, and then you get the modern form with its new engines in the last 2 stories. While the Kuldey Fell doesn't exactly add anything to the series as a whole, I think the book is still great because it is supreme world building. Here's a selection of stories on this new area of the island of Sodor we've never touched before, filling in some of those gaps of open space. If the concept is novel, and the stories are all fun, and it introduces something new for the series, is the book really all that pointless? This humble reader thinks not. Number 12. The Little Old Engine. Ah, yes. Finally, the really good Skarloey books. It's a shame Chris's Skarloey books are so forgettable, because Wilbert's are some of the best of the whole series. This book covers the return of Skarloey from the works, and fills us in on everything that's happened since he left. We learn of Peter Sam's big incline accident that damaged his funnel, and we meet Rusty and Duncan, who arrived while he was gone. In fact, it's the only book where Rusty really gets any sort of focus. The last story is very fun, where the BBC comes to the Skarloey to film it. I love how all the characters that are presently on the railway get some focus in this book. Sir Handel and Peter Sam share the first story, Skarloey and Duncan get the second, then Rusty and Duncan in the third, and they all come together to take it away in the last story. A pretty loose structure, but all the characters are covered. What's really notable about this one is the mention of Peter Sam's and Sir Handel's old line in Little Old Twins.
Men came and did that on our old line. And then, said Sir Handel, soon afterwards, it was sold, finished Peter Sam mournfully.
We've gotten a couple mentions of their old line in the past. In fact, Peter Sam mentions it to Skarloey in this book, but it's still very much a mystery at this point. We find out here that the line closed and the engines were picked off. Little by little over the course of the whole series, we keep being fed bits of information that will eventually lead up to something big. But we'll get there. Number 11. Gallant Old Engine. Both this and Little Old Engine place basically the same on the list for me, because they both exist to cover basically the same things. Skarloey and Rheneas' returns to the railway respectively, and fill us in on what's happened on the railway since we last saw it. This time we focus on Rheneas' return. Just like Little Old Engine, Gallant's structure is pretty loose, having 3 unrelated stories, with the final one subtly tied into the previous. This being Duncan's strike on the viaduct leading into Skarloey telling him about Rheneas. Both of these books are equally great to me, but I place Gallant just a tad higher because I think I like the stories in it more. I mean, come on, this one has Steamroller in it, which is hilarious.
You swank around with steamroller wheels, pretending you're as good as me. Actually, I'm better. Goodbye.
I also really like Special Funnel, for its status quo change for Peter Sam. From this book onwards, he is always illustrated with the strange Giesel ejector funnel. I like that. Another example of these characters' ever-changing evolutions over the series. A wonderful book, and just like the previous, captures the charm of the Skarloey engines and the real-life Tallyclin Railway so well. Number 10. The Three Railway Engines. This is definitely the least realistic book, and the most simple. If you had asked me a couple years ago where I'd place this on a ranking list, I probably would have put it towards the bottom with James. I mean, come on. Bricking an engine up in a tunnel and blocking your main line? That's just so silly. A real working railway would not do that. However, I've learned to really appreciate this book over the years. When you understand that the Railway series started out as simple bedtime stories and evolved into something much bigger later on, you kind of learn to love this book just for starting it all. Everything begins here. Gordon's character arc beautifully starts here. The young, rude, boastful hotshot. As does Edward's, which sets him up as an old, outdated engine, ready to prove himself as capable as the others. You got Henry too, who's set up here as a stuffy, self-important curmudgeon, and that of course softens as the years go on. All three get their own stories, and then come together in the final one for a satisfying conclusion. These first Railway series books are such relics of that early period where Sodor wasn't fully figured out yet, where all these background engines appear that aren't related to anything, and none of the locations are consistent. It's fun to look back on them to see just how much things have changed and evolved over time since then. The Three Railway Engines is the one that started it all, and is, in my opinion, an absolute crime not to include it in the top 10. Number 9. Four Little Engines. The book that introduces the Skarloey Railway. The book that came to be because Wilbert was so inspired by the real Talyllyn Railway in Wales and wanted a version of it in his series. I absolutely love this book. It's a wonderful yet simple introduction to this railway and characters. The introduction of a narrow gauge railway opens up the world even more into unexplored territory. Now Sodor has a mountain range with a railway that climbs the valley. The story opportunities are endless. Gotta love Wilbert, always world building, adding new things to his universe. The structure is great, with the first story that exists basically as an exposition dump to explain the railway to the audience and how it works. It also cleverly sets up Rheneas being sent away to the works, and Peter, Sam, and Sir Handel arriving, which all comes into play in later books. The second story is about Sir Handel, third is about Peter, Sam, and Skarloey comes back to get the finale. All three of the characters are so strong and different from each other. The optimist, the recluse, and the wise old sage. I think the only thing that's a little weird about this book is the title, Four Little Engines. Kinda strange when one of the four is barely present in it, but that's my only gripe. It's the book that introduced the Skarloey, the heart and soul of the Railway series, and it definitely deserves a spot in the top 10. Number 8. Thomas the Tank Engine. Oh, come on. This one has to be in the top 10. While Thomas's book is absolutely the most overplayed, overused, overpublicized, and overly referenced book of the franchise, it's a damn good book. Only the second volume of the series, and yet it works as a completely standalone book. And I think that's why it was such a home run success. Many people could just buy this single book for their kids and it sufficed. It has a clear start, middle, and end, and you don't need to know much about the other characters present in this for this book to work. Why this book works so well for me is Thomas's character arc. It is structured absolutely perfectly. He starts out as a young cheeky prick and experiences real growth over the course of the stories. The first story introduces him and shows him at his worst. In the second story, he has a clear want, a clear goal, and actively tries to achieve it. He gets his chance, but blows it and humiliates himself. The third story, he gets another chance, and really tries, but he blows it again. He's super sympathetic now. He's growing. The fourth story, he comes through and saves the day, and finally achieves the goal he wanted, to get out of the yard and finally see more of the world. Perfect structure, and Thomas himself here is a wonderful role model for kids. I love me a really good character arc, and it's really easy for me to see why this book, and Thomas himself, was the one that took off. It may be overplayed, and it may be overused, but for good reason. It's a damn good book, starring a character I think all of us can see a little of ourselves in. Speaking of really good character arcs, number 7, Gordon the Big Engine. Here's a book I bet a lot of you didn't expect to be ranked so high. It's no secret that I love Gordon and I think he is the protagonist of the Railway series. The series follows his entire journey from start to finish. A young newcomer in the first book, and then a humbled old man who retires in the final book. So it shouldn't be a shock to you all that his book ranks very highly for me. This book is the big game changer for Gordon's character. Up until this one, he has always been an ass. Self-important, boastful, rude to others, thinking he can get away with anything because he's the top Link Express engine on the railway. He is too good for goods work. He is too good to shunt his own coaches. Little engines like Thomas and Percy and Edward shouldn't be cheeky to him. It all finally comes to a boiling point in the first story here, where Gordon finally takes things too far and gets himself in the most trouble he has ever been in. So much so that the Fat Controller flat out takes the Express away from him. Gordon, truly in disgrace. The title, Off the Rails, is brilliant. Literally that's what happens to Gordon in this book, but also figuratively. This book follows Gordon while he's in his disgrace period, and this is where his character shift finally starts. In the next story, he takes pity on a distressed James and helps him out, and then in the next story, he and Thomas form an alliance and finally put their differences aside. And I love that they forever stick to this. Never again, ever, throughout the whole series, are Thomas or Gordon ever rude to each other again. These two have formed a solid friendship. All of this comes to a beautiful close in the last story, where the two put in a good word for each other and win over the Fat Controller. Gordon's disgrace period ends in the best way possible. He escorts the Queen herself to the island of Sodor. This book hits it out of the park when it comes to structure. This is a huge stepping stone in the ongoing story of Gordon's character journey, and even as a standalone book, his arc in this is wonderful. The characters actually grow and change in this volume. Gordon still has a lot of growing up to do over the series, of course, but this is the book that turns him, a despicable character, into a sympathetic one. One we want to see continue to achieve. A fantastic, very overlooked volume, and one of my favorites. Number 6. I wish I could say I did this intentionally. Okay, anyways. Number 6. Small Railway Engines. Never overlook a Little Railway series book, because boy oh boy, does this one pack a punch. What Small Railway Engines does extremely well is establish characters. 3 all-new characters are introduced in this book, as well as a whole railway, and some humans. And all 3 of those engine characters are extraordinarily strong and different from each other. Again, structure is key. The first story is all exposition. Sets up why this new railway was built, who these 3 little engines are that run it, Bert, Mike, and Rex. And each of them get a story afterwards to really establish who they are. Bert gets tit for tat, Mike gets Mike's whistle, and Rex gets useful railway. Bert is very vengeful and naive. Mike is always grouchy about something, and Rex is the more chipper but overzealous. This is a really funny book. All 3 of these engines are so hot-tempered and snappy all the time, and as a result, none of them ever win in their respective stories. Bert gets splashed with mud, Mike loses his whistle, Rex derails hilariously. They're all equal to each other, on the same playing field, and come to realize at the end of the book that only when they work together as a team, they are prosperous. A typical moral, sure, but one that is realized well. World building wise, oh boy, do we get a lot of stuff in this one. We learn there's an old standard gauge line up the coast to where this new small railway is, which of course comes into play in a later book and becomes the Little Western. We're introduced to the thin and fat clergymen, which are of course Wilbert Audrey and Teddy Boston. I just love that. Wilbert actually put himself in the series as a character. The Railway series is just so meta. I also love this running gag of Wilbert always writing Teddy as a buffoon. Every time Teddy is in a story, he gets humiliated in some way. In this book, he gets drenched with steam water. You can tell that these two had a very funny friendship. Wilbert and Teddy are so well established in this book too, almost as if they're characters that will reappear in a later book. One of the funnest books of the series. Love all the world building and meta references in this one. Number 5. Duck and the Diesel Engine. This is such a heavy book. So much happens in this one. This is the big book that introduces Diesel, and Diesels in general, into the series, which becomes a main ongoing plot point as the series goes on. This book also focuses on Duck, the first one to, and he has a really awesome character arc in this. The first story, which is sort of unrelated to the Diesel debacle, sets everything up. The real-life steam engine celebrity city of Truro visits Sodor, and kickstarts Duck's big-headedness. When Diesel arrives, big-headed Duck plays a trick on him. Then Diesel devilishly gets back at him by spreading rumors, and the story goes on from there. There's some really nice continuity here with Duck's previous appearances. The big engines still hold a grudge against him for standing up to him a few books ago.
Yes, they said. He did it to us. We'll do it to him, and see how he likes it.
You can tell this big standoff between them has been something building up for a while now. While Domeless Engines is sort of unrelated to the Diesel plot, I just love how much of an in-joke that entire story is. In real life, there is an ongoing debacle to this day of which engine was the first to go 100 miles per hour, City of Truro or Flying Scotsman. Of course, Gordon, the A.L.I.S.O.N, is going to stick his nose up at Truro.
I never boast, but 100 miles an hour would be easy for me.
He tries to outdo him and fails miserably. You can definitely tell which side of the argument Audrey landed on. I've seen people say this book is kinda bad because it glosses over Diesel's comeuppance. It's just a line of dialogue spoken by the Fat Controller.
The Fat Controller smiled. I never believed Diesel. After you went, he told lies about Henry. So I sent him packing.
It would have been satisfying to see Diesel get the boot from the railway, sure. But the fact we don't see it is the point. This is Duck's book, not Diesel's. I think it actually plays better not seeing it. Why? Because Diesel, by design, is symbolically meant to be the most insignificant engine ever. Just one of a million of his type. Unspecial, not unique, just a clone of many nameless Diesel shunters across England. Plain black, no special paint, unnumbered. Hell, he doesn't even have a name. He's just Diesel. The fact we don't see his comeuppance just reinforces how insignificant he is in the big picture of things. The TV series plays Diesel off in a different way, more of the main antagonist of the show. But in the books, Diesel was just a symbol of the next upcoming thing in rail traction, and nothing more. He's an insignificant little cockroach. You kill him, it doesn't matter, because there's a million others just like him. I like to think Diesel was eventually scrapped on the mainland and lived a very uninteresting life. The only significant thing he ever did was cause some drama on Sodor once, and then he got kicked out of Trainhaven Island because of his own stupid hubris. How Diesel got found out and sent away doesn't really matter. This is Duck's book. What matters is that he proved himself a valuable asset to the railway at the end. And as a book devoted to Duck, he of course has a really great character arc. He gets a big head from City of Truro's visit, so big that he thought he could make a fool of the new guy and get away with it, only to have his friends turn on him and get sent away. That's why this book is so brilliant. In this story, you hate Diesel, but if you zoom out a little, Duck kind of deserved it. Both of these guys suck. Duck is just as bad as Diesel, kind of like a twisted mirror reflection of each other in a weird way. I also think the fact Audrey chose Duck, instead of someone more unique in design like Percy or someone, to catalyst the Diesel plot was brilliant. As I just described Diesel as, Duck is also kind of a nameless one in a million type of engine. He's a pannier tank, of which over 800 were built in real life. Diesel is more or less just a more modern version of Duck, the next in line of a numerous nameless clone army. Again, a twisted mere reflection of each other. There's a lot more here going on symbolically with this book than many of the others, but the difference between the two is Duck comes through at the end. Unlike Diesel, he proves himself a hero in the last story and wins everyone over, the Fat Controller included. Duck may be very similar to Diesel in a lot of ways, but he isn't a bad guy. Despite getting a big head and playing pranks he shouldn't have, he is indeed a crucial member of the fleet. This book served to purpose two things: flesh Duck out some, and introduce Diesels into the universe in a meaningful way, and it ticked both of those items on that checklist beautifully. A rather heavy book of the series with a lot of complex themes and symbolism. The deeper you dig, the more you uncover. One of Wilbert's finest volumes. Number 4. Mainline Engines. This has always been one of my favorite books of the series, for a number of reasons. First off, I just really love the illustrations in this, particularly the ones focused on the humans in the stations. There's an unusually large number of these, focusing on the frantic humans' reactions to various situations. And they're hysterical, with so much character and detail. This guy looks hilarious, this guy looks hilarious, I love how derpy this guy looks, I love how pissed James's driver is here, I love this old woman who is so oblivious to what's happening. Second, I love all the new stuff introduced in this book. There's a surprisingly lot of world building in this. We see Brendam Docks for the first time, and the China Clay Pits. We're introduced to Bill and Ben, and Boko, and we learn more of how the Express and Edward's services work. This book is kind of a sequel to Edward the Blue Engine, showing us more of his branch line and the engines and services on it. There isn't much of a structure to this book, it's really just a bunch of unrelated stories that tie in with things on Edward's branch. We get a story about Bill and Ben, a story about Boko meeting James, a story where Gordon gets sent down the branch by accident. All of these things related to Edward's branch, and then ends with a story focused on the man of the hour himself. A lot of important milestones occur in this book too. This is the final ever book with a story where Gordon is boastful and self-important, humbled by Boko, and putting an end to that chapter of his life. The younger, boastful Gordon ends here. The next time we see him, he's an older, jaded Gordon. This book also establishes Boko and what he represents in this series. Diesels in common use on the island of Sodor. The engines don't care for him at first, but do learn to respect him. Even Donald and Douglas give him some kind words.
And the other day they were heard to remark, "For a diesel, yon Boko's nae such a bad sort of engine." That, from the Caledonian twins, is high praise indeed.
The series' two longest plot arcs, Gordon's character journey and the phenomenon of dieselization, have significant steps in this book. Why this book is so special to me, though, is because it's a beautiful bookend to Edward's character arc. My all-time favorite story in the Railway series is in this book. You all knew this already, Edward's exploit. The story where Edward is put in the worst situation he's ever been in, with all the odds against him, and he still manages to pull through. After an entire series of engines putting him down, disrespecting him, saying he's out of date, calling him pathetic, here he comes one final time to prove everyone wrong, and put those insults to rest. And never again do any of the engines call Edward old or clapped out. This is the final ever story to feature Edward in Wilbert's books, and wow, what a grand way to send him off. Why this is called Mainline Engines is weird to me, considering the majority of the book takes place on Edward's branch and those characters. I know Branchline Engines was already used, so Wilbert couldn't use that title, so maybe the book should have been called like Edward's Branchline or something, or maybe like Indispensable Engines, I don't know. Mainline Engines is an unfitting title, especially considering Bill and Ben of all characters are on the cover. Mainline Engines, while it doesn't have a super solid structure, makes up for it with its heart, its world building, and its crucial steps in the series plots. A book that absolutely cannot be missed. Number 3. Very Old Engines. This is the best Skarloey book of them all, hands down. For several books we've gotten to know the charming little Skarloey railway engines, with so much implied history to them. And finally, here's the book that gets into it. The Skarloey and Rheneas origin story. This is one of Audrey's heaviest lore books, not only in just information on Skarloey and Rheneas themselves, but the entirety of Sodor. This is the only book that fully takes place in the 19th century, giving us a glimpse of what Sodor was like before the other Skarloey engines were there, before the Fat Controller, before Thomas, before Edward. It's a totally different world, with so many historical trivial reveals, such as Neil and the box tank engines that worked the original standard gauge railway, or how the engines had to arrive via ship to the island because a bridge wasn't built yet. Structure-wise, this book is excellent. In this book, Skarloey and Rheneas reminisce on their early days to the others in the lead-up to their 100th birthday. The first story is about Skarloey's initial arrival, The second story is about Reneus's and their first working days, and the third is basically about how the two became friends. All build up to the final story where they celebrate their 100th birthday in present day. However, the story doesn't end there. A big cliffhanger occurs in this story that isn't followed up on right away.
Peter Sam goggled in horror. The thin controller said the owner said, the Duke said, he was coming to our centenary to open our extension round the lake. And now he's scrapped. Oh dear, oh dear.
We learn of a character called Duke that Peter Sam is very distressed about. He's looking forward to this Duke coming to the celebration, only to be disappointed that the Duke that did arrive was a man. Peter Sam's Duke has never been mentioned before. The audience has no idea who this is. Who is this mysterious Duke? Well, that's an answer that will not be given to us until a much later volume. Very clever setup, Wilbert. Well done. I also think the illustrations in this book are some of the best of the whole series. Not only are they just really well drawn, pretty pictures, they are packed with references and in-jokes. I really love this one of Neil pulling Skjalg. In the foreground are a man and a woman scared beyond belief. This could be them screaming because of how ugly Neil is, or it could be them shocked in terror at the sight of a big scary steam train. Because remember, back in this time period, steam engines were new tech and the general public were scared of them in real life. I love how while they're trying to steam Skjalg, Mr. Mac is reading a book literally called How Engines Work. Very funny. I love the passage of time implied with the construction of the engine shed throughout the illustrations. And I love this look of utter disappointment and bewilderment on Peter Sam's face when the Duke is revealed. You can just tell he's lost for words. One of the Railway series' finest volumes, packed to the brim with good stories, fantastic illustrations, lore, and humor. Alright, we're down to 2, folks. Which is going to be number 2? Which one am I going to choose for best and second best? I believe number 2 rightfully goes to Enterprising Engines. What this book is a grand finale to so many of the main characters in Wilbert's books. Gordon, Henry, Douglas, and really the Northwestern Railway as a whole. The amount of love and passion that shines through this book is immeasurable. There isn't a solid plot to this book. It's basically 3 random stories that take place during Flying Scotsman's visit to Sodor. But man, all 3 of these stories are absolute bangers, which all come together at the end in the final story. The first story, Tenders for Henry, is a Gordon story. This is our first glimpse at a grown-up, mature adult Gordon, learning the harsh truths of real life. He is no longer boastful and brash. He is now a jaded, depressed character who learns the fates of his brothers on the mainland here. Out of the kindness of his heart to cheer Gordon up, the Fat Controller brings Flying Scotsman to Sodor, and the 2 brothers reunite. We learn so much about Gordon's history and his family in this story. Had Chris not continued the Gordon character arc in his books, this really would have made a nice, happy end for the character. Same can be said for Henry in the next story, Super Rescue, where a dejected Henry pulls through and heroically rescues 2 broken down diesels, really showing how far he has come since the beginning. Henry, the one who is infamously pathetic and always needing repairs, ends up being the biggest Chad of the series and one of the most beloved stories of the entire Railway series. Again, this was a spiritual finale for the character, and would have been his last story if Chris hadn't continued the series. Bear is also introduced in this story, and I really like what he represents too. A young, innocent, wide-eyed do-gooder with a heavy respect to his steam ancestors. They're like gods to him, and he's in total disbelief that one could fail in the same way he could.
You? Failed? And yet? His voice trailed away in admiration.
An all-new perspective on diesels in this series. Douglas gets his moment as well in, again, another well-beloved story, Escape, when he saves Oliver from British Railways and stows him away to Sodor. Escape is epic already for its bold story and cool visuals, but it's poetically a brilliant piece, being a nice cap end on Douglas's story arc. Remember, Douglas was also a stowaway to Sodor. Donald brought him there. So here he gets to return the favor and save someone else. So poetically satisfying.
Yon's an enterprising engine, he thought. I'll run away here with Donald, but I'd have been feared to do it on my own.
And everything comes to a close in the last story. Flying Scotsman leaves, Henry puts in a good word for Bear, who joins the railway, and the Fat Controller agrees to save Oliver. It's such a feel-good book, and had this been the finale to the whole series, I think it would have sufficed most fans. It's a no-brainer why Enterprising Engines is so beloved, and rightfully so.
Ever since Skjalg and Renius had their 100th birthday, Peter Sam had been worried. He kept on saying that the real Duke never came. Our Duke is an engine. Once upon a time, 3 little engines lived in their own little shed on their own little railway. Duke was brown, Falcon blue, and Stuart green. Duke was the oldest. He had been the first engine on the line, and named after the Duke of Sodor. He was proud of this, and wanted everything just so.
Duke the Lost Engine is Wilbert Awdry's magnum opus. The big payoff to years and years of world building and clever setups and cliffhangers. The payoff to the introduction of the thin and fat clergyman in small railway engines. The old track bed the Arlesdale Railway was built upon. The explanation for the abandoned harbor rebuilt on the Little Western. And the final answer to every question posed in the Skarloey books. Where did Sir Handel and Peter Sam come from? What's the deal with their old line they've mentioned numerous times? And who is this mysterious Duke? This starts as a flashback book, based back in the old days when Peter Sam and Sir Handel, called Stuart and Falcon respectively back then, worked on a line called the Mid-Sodor Railway, alongside their mentor figure, Duke. In this book, we learn everything. The railway ran from the lead mines in the hills to the harbor at Arlesborough, and when hard times came, the line closed, Falcon and Stuart were sold off, and Duke was left in a shed, which was buried over time. The book later transitions to modern day. Wilbert and Teddy learn of Duke, and they set out to find him. A beautiful payoff to their introductions in small railway engines. Duke is found quite by accident, naturally by Teddy being a buffoon and falling through the roof of the shed. Well done, Wilbert. Glad to see you're keeping the gag going. Duke is rescued, brought to the Little Western, and then taken to the Skarloey Railway, where the whole engine family reunites. So many elements from previous books come together for this grand finale payoff. The small railway engines, the Little Western, the clergymen, the Skarloey engines. Wilbert initially wrote this book as the finale to the Railway series, at an even 25 books, providing answers to all the questions he posed in the series leading up to this. And you know what? I think this is a very satisfying finale book. Enterprising Engines was a wonderful send-off to the main standard gauge engines. In this one, bookends the narrow gauge characters beautifully. It of course didn't work out that way, and the series continued on because the publishers wanted more. But rereading this with the mindset that Wilbert wrote it as a finale, it definitely hits differently. Duke was the final boss of the whole series, subtly mentioned or inferred numerous times prior. An engine that survived for over 20 years in the most unlikely of ways. Reborn. A relic from old Sodor, made new again. In a series that was a love letter to steam engines, I don't think you could have picked a more unique and special engine to end the series with. I wholeheartedly think Duke the Lost Engine is the best Railway series book. Wilbert Awdry's magnum opus. It is the most emotional and conclusive installment of the entire series.
But his old eyes twinkled, and for the first time in years he smiled as he dozed in the sun.
And that, my friends, was the entire Railway series. What a ride. I hope you all enjoyed listening to me ramble about these books for an hour and a half, as much as I enjoyed revisiting them all for this video. I really do recommend picking up yourselves copies of them if you don't have them already. Wilbert's books are easily available in a book set or in a collection book from any online retailer. They usually get re-released every few years. While Chris's are a bit harder to find. Thankfully, fellow Thomas Tuber sidekick Jason has uploaded a PDF of all of Chris's books onto Drive, and I want to give him a huge thank you for doing that. Revisiting the actual text of the books really helped me a lot for this video. Link to that PDF is in the description. Before you go, I want to promote one more thing. We talked a lot about Wilbert Awdry in this video today. Well, how would you like to be a part of a celebration dedicated to the man himself? That's right, the Talyllyn Railway is holding another of its annual Awdry extravaganzas this year, after the huge record-breaking success of last year's. An event celebrating all things Wilbert Awdry and his creations. At this event at the Talyllyn Railway itself in Wales, you'll see the actual original artwork from the Railway series on display, historical lectures of Sodor hosted by Tim Dunn himself, you'll be able to drive the actual Duncan, see Awdry's own model Farquhar layout in action, and much more. Tickets on sale now. Link in the description. Wilbert's stories have touched my life in a way that forever changed it, and I want to do everything I can to promote this event for the railway that inspired him the most. If you live in the UK or plan on visiting this summer, be sure to come on down. Thank you all, as always, for your continued support. This whole ranking video was brought to you by my loyal patrons, who all voted for this to be the next video. If you choose to become a patron of mine, you'll get to participate in the voting of the next big video, as well as get 2-day early access to all new videos, and you'll get your name in the end credits just like you see now. Link to my Patreon is also in the description. Have a nice day, everyone, and I'll see y'all in the next one. Long live the Railway series.